Hi, all. Welcome. We will get started in just 1 second. Hi, my name is Jenny. I'm the president and CEO of the National Immigration Forum, and I'm pleased to welcome you here today. You are here for the second webinar in our series called Security and. It's a campaign we're pleased to offer. We will have experts join us from security, but also other fields to address the intersection of security and other core American values. If you joined us for our first webinar focused on security and compassion, thank you so much. We're so glad to have you back with us today. The Security and campaign is the opportunity to examine how the United States does not need to choose between security and our other core values, which we hold dear. We can choose security and flourishing communities, security and respect for human dignity, security and a thriving economy. American people have expressed that while we want to ensure the border is secure, we also value economic security, community safety, humanitarian protections, and building a fair and modern immigration system. And so we have to have policies that support these priorities. They support prioritizing security at the southern border, definitely, but they maintain also that we need to have rule of law, due process, humanitarian protections, and treat migrants with respect. Security and the rule of law is today's focus. We're excited to announce a brand new set of survey results that do relate to this topic. Just this week, we did a survey with the Bullfinch Group, and a strong majority of Americans who responded support people detained by immigration authorities having a chance to defend themselves under due process before being deported. The spread was actually 40 percentage points, and fewer than a quarter or 25% of respondents were in opposition. A majority of conservatives surveyed support due process as well. And so we're glad to follow up with anyone who's interested about this poll. And so with that, I'm pleased to turn the mic over to Larry Benenson, the forum's Vice President of Policy and Advocacy. He'll talk a bit more about today's topic, introduce these incredible panelists, and lead the discussion. Thank you for joining us today. Larry, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jenny, and it's great being with all of you today. So as Jenny said, today we're going to be discussing how to uphold security while fostering community partnerships and preserving the constitutional right to due process. The Trump administration's immigration enforcement actions over the past few weeks have raised concerns about adherence to the rule of law and adherence to due process. In fact, some of the administration are even openly questioning these core principles. So with all that's happening in these first few months of the second Trump administration, these issues remain more important than ever. At the forum, as Jenny said, we believe that immigration policies must follow the rule of law, must protect due process, and adhere to humane practices. And this is no way inconsistent with security and public safety. We can do all of this. So today we're joined by leaders from the law enforcement and national security spheres who are going to talk about these issues further and engage in a great conversation about protecting security as we remember to adhere to the rule of law. So first, I'm going to introduce Police Chief Ramon Batista. Chief Batista is Police Chief of the Santa Monica, California Police Department and is also the co-chair of the Law Enforcement Immigration Task Force. Chief Batista's career in law enforcement spans 38 years, and he became police chief of Santa Monica in 2021. Next, we have Stewart Verdery, who is a leader on the Council on National Security and Immigration. Stewart is a partner and founder of Monument Advocacy here in Washington, D.C., and previously served as the Assistant Secretary for Policy and Planning at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security during the George W. Bush administration. In fact, he was the first person to hold that position in the newly created DHS. And fun fact, he was confirmed unanimously by the U.S. Senate to that position, something that we don't see a lot of these days when you get to positions that touch on immigration policy.
Wouldn't happen now.
Wouldn't happen now, unfortunately, but we're going to have a conversation and hopefully get back to a place where that could happen. So with that, I want to turn to the panelists now and kind of set out where we are in terms of context here as we talk about rule of law and security issues. So, the Trump administration, since coming into office in January, has repeatedly asserted um, the security threats of migration to the United States. They've asserted the southern border is out of control, that the U.S. is under invasion, that immigrants are carrying out a crime wave of sorts. And as they've taken increasingly aggressive enforcement steps, just want to kind of level set to talk about where these issues actually stand and separate reality from overstatement. So, I guess to start off initially, from what you see on the ground, Chief Batista, is there in fact an immigrant crime wave occurring right now?
So not only, and sorry, Jenny, Larry, and members of the forum, welcome and thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. So Larry, I got to tell you that from my perspective on the ground, I don't see an immigrant crime wave as described, but what I do see is a pretty concerted effort with the rhetoric and the highlighting of specific crimes that have occurred where immigrants have been involved. But that in no way really gives you the full picture of the amount of crime that we have in the United States and for what component immigrants are related to it. Study after study has shown that immigrants don't commit more crimes than US citizens. As a matter of fact, they're pretty much at the same level, if not less, probably due to the fact that their focus is more on coming here, working, taking on the jobs that nobody else is doing and just trying to make a better life for themselves. They're certainly not the ones that are at the leading edge of crime in this country. 2020 was a period where obviously crime across the country rose, and there's probably going to be many experts over the course of many years that are going to debate that and try to figure out exactly what all the components were to it. But even as we stand here today in 2025, we're seeing that the homicide rate across the country is beginning to drop. Violent crime across the country, across big cities, is on the decline for the first time in a long time. And the drop, especially in homicides, is especially notable. But of course, that doesn't leave us off the hook when it comes to individuals, human beings that if they have an ill intent are going to be hell bent on committing a crime. But that does not mean that immigrants in this country are involved in some type of a crime spree, despite that narrative. And I can see how it happens. I think that human beings have this affinity for being foundationally safe. They want to feel as though they can go out and enjoy the open space without fear of harm or a threat. And when there's the opportunity to then highlight a particular incident and make it so that we can pin blame or assess a component of responsibility to a particular group and other. I think that those things have come to light and people have done that, but it doesn't really reflect the actual events that are occurring on the ground.
Great. Thanks so much, Chief. I want to go back to you, Stewart, on this initial round of questions. So, I think going back throughout the 2024 election cycle and really over the past 3 4 years, we did see a dramatic increase in terms of encounters at the border, more people crossing irregularly. But what is the current status of the border? What are we seeing today, and how has that shifted over the past 12-18 months?
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me. It's always nice to do these events with the forum and the chief, and nice working with you on this. Well, we saw a slowdown in kind of border numbers throughout 2024 as the then Biden-Harris administration put in new rules around dealing with folks who were showing up in an undocumented fashion, and the numbers did begin to decline. Now, that's not nearly what's happened since President Trump returned to office and put in some fairly draconian asylum rules, and it seems that the numbers of encounters has really dropped to historical lows, which they're obviously trying to take a great deal of credit for. And we'll have to see whether the courts eventually allow a system that doesn't, for all intents and purposes, allow any asylum claims, which is basically the way they're interpreting the laws right now. And those cases are being litigated right now. I will say that remember at the beginning of the first Trump administration, we saw a similar decline, maybe not to this extent, but a similar decline. But eventually, the economic pull factors bringing people to the country for work returned, and we will see if that happens again as our economy is in need of workers in many segments of the economy. I think the most interesting thing for me is, the reconciliation, the tax bill here in DC is going to fund fairly significant increases in border security funding. And the question is, are they funding the right things? There's a lot of money for border infrastructure and for border patrol agents. Are you really going to, if you want to change the dynamic on the border when there aren't that people trying to sneak in, are you focused on today's border or 2023's border? Because they're not the same thing at all. So if you were looking at today's border and you wanted to have a much stronger system, you'd be looking at investing in detention capability and ICE and potentially overstay enforcement, which, as we know, is a decent chunk of those who end up in the undocumented population. I will give the administration credit. They are thinking about the border. It's not just the physical southwest border. It's the whole country as an immigration system, and they are thinking of it that way. I agree with the chief's analysis on, immigrant crime wave and that kind of rhetoric. At the same time, we shouldn't dismiss that amongst any large numbers of people, there are going to be a few bad apples, and we should never dismiss victims of violent crime, no matter who the perpetrator is. So, I don't think we should do that at all. What I don't quite understand, and I think we'll get to this later, is why the administration is fixated on these fringe cases, why they're really trying to push the legal envelope. And we'll get to some of these, I'm sure, when the underlying immigration laws give federal enforcement a lot of authority to deport people, to hold people, those kinds of things. So why they're kind of finding these fringe edge cases to push the envelope and fighting with judges and these other things. I don't quite understand why they're doing this so early in the administration, but we can get to those cases here. Maybe we get to another round of questions.
Great. Thanks, Stuart. Thanks for setting the table there. I do want to talk about one use of authority that's gotten a lot of attention, and it's some of what we've seen in terms of the administration taking away student visas or issuing notices to international students that they no longer are going to be able to study in the United States. I would actually distinguish this. There are a couple very prominent cases that have been highlighted in terms of campus protest activity, but there actually were around at least, I think, 1,500 students who were notified they were in danger of losing their student visa and would need to leave the country over various interactions with law enforcement that are showing up on federal databases. And many of these appear to be pretty flawed. The administration actually backed down on this policy. They announced in court they were going to reinstate those people, but take additional steps in the future to make sure that the international student population was secure. But this is a rare case where the administration did take a step back. And the administration, as you said, Stuart, has a lot of authority in this area in terms of removing visas. But I actually just want to ask you to share your insight. What happened here with the administration marking all of these students as ineligible, telling them they needed to leave the country and then reversing themselves? And do any of these students pose a security threat? And if so, why was this so much broader than it seems like it could have been if the administration was focused on the security piece of this?
Sure. Well, this comes in a broader environment where the administration is, for lack of a better word, at war with higher education. Because we've seen, there's fights about federal funding and decertification. They've talked about blocking, grants. We've had, universities kind of saying they would reverse all kinds of policies to not lose their federal funding, with Columbia and others. Harvard, on their hands, going the other direction and trying to fight. So this is part of a larger environment. I think it's fair to say that both these statements can be true simultaneously. One, students coming to the U.S. to study and often to work is a huge advantage for our country in terms of economic progress, exposure to democracy and human rights and capitalism that we want people to come here and experience. And secondly, that schools and the administration ought to do more to ensure that the very small percentage of foreign students that break serious laws or receive serious sanctions from their schools should lose their student visas and student status. I think the question is, why can't we have due process along the way? And we've seen some pretty terrible cases where people, were kind of swept up because they wrote an op-ed or something like that. as opposed to the person who, was barricaded inside of an administration building and eventually expelled. Those are very different cases. And the administration ought to be able to kind of differentiate between the two. It can't be the policy that any foreign student who expresses concern for the Palestinians or criticism of Israel is deportable. Of all the issues students ought to be debating civilly, this is like top of the list. It's one of the most complicated issues that we deal with. So, we certainly should not allow students to threaten or physically harass other students, take over buildings, and those kinds of things. So, this is part of a larger battle. Administration, as you said, has backed down in some cases already, and they're going to have to litigate exactly what the free speech rights are for foreign students, and that'll be dealt in the courts.
Thanks, Stewart. Chief Batista, I want to turn back to you and talk about the administration's approach to engaging with local law enforcement, and in many cases attempting to pull in local law enforcement to help it help the administration carry out its immigration enforcement priorities. So, again, going back to 2024 campaign, President Trump ran on a platform calling for significantly increased interior immigration enforcement. I think many of us remember at the convention the signs that said mass deportation now. We see the administration taking dramatic steps to really ramp up enforcement and look at ways that it can get more help from local law enforcement. And one of the programs they have is something called the Section 287G program, which refers to a part of the U.S. Code. And that's something which does implicate local law enforcement. So I'll ask you, Chief, can you tell us about this program that is voluntary to local law enforcement, but has some pitfalls as well? Can you tell us a little bit more about this program and maybe what some of the pros and cons are? It's something that the administration has dramatically expanded over the last several weeks.
Yeah, so the 287G program has been around for a while. It is legal, and essentially, U.S. immigration enforcement officers will deputize local law enforcement officers with the ability to do a certain amount of background work in the immigration system to determine if a person that's in custody is here legally or not, and to begin to do some of that vetting out of persons, especially those that are incarcerated in municipal jails or county jails. And there are municipalities across the country that have increased their participation in the program. But remember, it's a legal program. Yeah, that's true. But it's also voluntary. It's not mandated. Local law enforcement has the discretion to join it or not. And to be honest with you, the way I look at it is that participation should really be judged not on the legality, but on the alignment of law enforcement's mission and values in community safety and constitutional policing versus the work of immigration enforcement, which we know is the full realm of the federal government. And it's really that component of law enforcement is outside of our primary mission. And it's never been one that completely aligns with my values and philosophies, and certainly a lot of other police chiefs and law enforcement officers that I've spoken to. Because in my estimation, every hour that we spend on this type of immigration work is an hour that's taken away from crime prevention and emergency response and community engagement, which there's never going to be enough community engagement and building trust with our communities. And certainly being a part of the 287G program, I think, cuts a big divide in that effort.
Yeah, thanks, Chief, for that insight. And I'll add that it's somewhat of a carrot and stick approach by the administration. The 287G program, only a minority of law enforcement agencies, local law enforcement agencies, have availed themselves of that. But the other side of this is, of course, is the administration increasingly is leaning on so-called sanctuary jurisdictions, or what it's calling sanctuary jurisdictions, to carry out immigration enforcement activities. And the administration has at times talked about perhaps sanctioning cities and localities that limit their interaction with federal authorities. um, and have even threatened at times to withhold federal funds, or even at times in extreme cases have talked about even prosecuting local officials. And I see kind of as our panel is going, we have another panelist I think join us, Margaret Stock. Um, and Margaret, I don't know if I can quickly introduce you and put you on the spot right as you're joining this panel. Let's see if we can get Margaret up here. Great, thank you, Margaret.
Hey, and I'm
Um,
sorry to be late to join you. I had an emergency at the office. I
No problem.
apologize.
Well, this proves. I'll just say quickly. Margaret Stock is in fact a working immigration lawyer, and for those of us in the immigration space, we know that this is a time where there is a lot going on. So I'll just say that Margaret adds perspective to this panel. She also is on the Council on National Security and Immigration. Served as a retired lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army Reserve, spending 28 years as a military police officer, and is an immigration attorney at Cascadia Cross Border Law Group LLC. So, Margaret, thank you for joining us. You're just in time for this question. As we're talking about the sanctuary city issue, the ability of the administration to threaten to withhold grants, even prosecute people. What limits are there on the administration in compelling localities to carry out its priorities? And are there limits that were set up by the Supreme Court as to what the administration can do in terms of federal funding in this area?
Well, going back to the basic structure of a country, we're supposed to be a federal republic, and the states and localities are supposed to have the police power, and they're not supposed to have to do everything that the federal government says all the time. That's the kind of the basic structure of our government. But the theory behind immigration law also is that it's not just about enforcement, it's also about benefits. So it makes the situation pretty complicated for state and local governments because they are supposed to be policing the local community, and that includes investigating crimes where they're going to need the cooperation of immigrants, and immigrants are entitled to certain benefits for having cooperated with the police in investigations of crimes and so forth. And we seem to be in an administration now that recognizes the enforcement side of immigration law, but doesn't recognize the benefit side so much. And there's a balance there that has to be made. State and local police want to be able to investigate a crime, and they often need immigrants to cooperate in the investigations of those crimes. But if they're going to be totally focused on arresting everybody and deporting them, that's going to undercut their ability to investigate crimes. And that's going to be a major problem, when it comes to actually the welfare of the community. You can't have a situation where, for example, a U.S. citizen's committing a crime against an immigrant spouse, and they're trying to get the government to deport the immigrant spouse who's the victim of the crime. That's kind of the classic situation that you're required to do some balancing.
Yeah, and Margaret, with the administration talking about you know, halting funds to what it's deeming sanctuary jurisdictions, which sanctuary jurisdiction doesn't have a definition under the U.S. Code. There are various definitions
Right.
that apply to it. But in terms of halting funds, I know this is an area where we've seen the Supreme Court step in and lay out some guidelines. In the first Trump administration, for example, there was litigation back and forth on whether they could withhold a narrow band of law enforcement grants, and courts ruled both ways. But if they're talking about a broader set of withholding of grants, kind of what's it in just in sum in like a minute or two, what limits are on the administration in terms of what it can do to withhold grants if it disagrees with this type of policy decision, even assuming they can compel some action?
Well, they can't be coercive is sort of the basic test. And it dates back to a Supreme Court case, the Dole case involving the underage drinking issue from many, many years ago, where the federal government was trying to force all the states to have the same drinking age, basically, by withholding highway funds. And the Supreme Court said you can't do that. We're a federal republic and we have federalism, and this federal government can't be coercive. So there's supposedly some free rights among the states to make decisions about what policies they're going to enact,
Yeah.
and so
See, you have cases then in which I think the more recent one was the Affordable Care Act, where
right.
all Medicaid funding was essentially conditioned on the Medicaid expansion. And the court said they can government can get voluntary expansion, but can't be coercive, can't have that as a condition, and they left it to the states to do that. So Yeah, so there are some real limits there. I want to turn it back to the chief. You laid out Margaret already. Margaret laid out, some of the issues confronting law enforcement in this area, but just I guess taking a step back, chief, like kind of what you said already, what Margaret said already, but what are some of the costs to local law enforcement in addition to this, in being identified as carrying out immigration functions? Like, how does the community react to that if you, as the local law enforcement agency, is seen as the arm of the federal government in carrying out immigration enforcement?
Well, I'll tell you, I've lived through this through my time in Arizona. It is a wedge issue where we are trying to build trust with communities, and just the same way that Margaret described, if that community is viewing us as an extension of federal immigration authorities, then our ability to connect, our ability to get information, to protect victims, to identify suspects that are preying on innocent immigrant populations makes it that much harder. And if you think about like our role in public safety is to protect the innocent. And so the understanding that we're going to be viewed in a particular way that causes distrust amongst the victims we're trying to help. It just makes it so that there's going to be greater ease of victimization and the inability to then be able to capture those criminals behind the scenes that are victimizing innocent people. And like I can't think of a more distorted view of what we're supposed to be doing. We're not the immigration police, right? Our job is to be the guardians of our neighborhoods. Federal immigration enforcement is that responsibility of DHS, ICE, CBP, but that work should not be outsourced to municipal law enforcement.
Great. Thanks, Chief Batista. I want to move on to another rule of law issue that was actually just in the news this week, or last week, I should say, which is the president's executive order purporting to end birthright citizenship, at least for some children of undocumented parents and temporary legal residents. That case has already been challenged multiple times in the courts. We've seen a bunch of injunctions. Last Thursday, the Supreme Court heard arguments over this, not on the merits of birthright citizenship itself, but on sort of whether it was appropriate to have nationwide injunctions generally. Um, and I think it seems like the takeaway from that is the court is more skeptical of those types of nationwide injunctions, but seem to be cool to the Trump administration's arguments on the underlying issue of whether we have birthright citizenship guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. So, Margaret, I know you've written on this extensively. You've studied this. Can you kind of lay out the administration's arguments that the 14th Amendment excludes these groups from birthright citizenship, and kind of give your assessment on the likelihood of or your take on whether those arguments can square with what existing precedent is?
Well, it's pretty easy to answer that. The arguments the administration is making are extremely weak and don't square with any existing precedent. The language of the 14th Amendment is crystal clear. It says anyone who is born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof is a citizen of the United States. What the administration is trying to argue is that the language subject to the jurisdiction excludes certain people who have never been excluded before. And in their preference, their policy preference, they want to exclude the children of temporary workers, people here on temporary visas, and the children of undocumented immigrants. It's just factual that the United States government has always recognized the children of those individuals as citizens of the United States. Just that's always been the case. So this is a new policy preference by the administration. And it's not supported by any case law or any prior policies or any court cases that have previously been decided. So it's basically the executive branch deciding that they don't like the current interpretation of the Constitution and they want to interpret it a different way. Of course, the recognized way of fixing that kind of problem is to pass a constitutional amendment. But instead of trying to amend the Constitution with an amendment, what they're trying to do is amend it with an executive order. And so, unsurprisingly, there have been nationwide injunctions issued in a number of different courts saying that this is unconstitutional and illegal. And that's the issue that's up in front of the Supreme Court right now, is whether a nationwide injunction can be issued, or do these cases have to be litigated individually in different states. The interesting thing about this case to me is just the chaos it's going to cause administratively if the administration gets its interpretation into law. And that's because basically people are going to forum shop where to have babies all over America. There are some states where the language subject to the jurisdiction is not in the law, such as my state, Alaska, and the state of Hawaii. So that means if the administration gets its way and interprets the Constitution differently, and that interpretation is upheld by the courts, we're going to see a lot of people trying to have babies in Alaska and Hawaii because their kids will be citizens if they're born in Alaska or Hawaii, but maybe not in other states. So it's going to be very chaotic. And the administration also admitted that they don't have any plan for implementing this interpretation. When they were in front of the Supreme Court, they admitted that that they have no plan for how they're going to do the paperwork or the interpretation here. So basically, bottom line is, if they do manage to convince the Supreme Court that we can't have nationwide injunctions in place over the birthright citizenship situation, we're going to have a lot of chaos. And a lot of people are going to be crossing state lines to have babies in more favorable jurisdictions, which is going to get really interesting. So whether you're a citizen or not is going to turn on whether you're born in Texas versus Alaska. And that doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Great. Thanks so much, Margaret, for laying all that out there. I guess I want to turn to Stewart to give his assessment on what we saw, though, on Thursday, at least from the media reports and, to the extent you were able to follow some of the arguments. Again, it seemed like, at least my read of it is, it seemed like the court was skeptical of the underlying merits argument, aside from the scope of the nationwide injunction. How do you see this shaking out, Stuart? Do you think, we have three Trump appointees on the Supreme Court. The makeup of the court is different than it was, say, 6 years ago. Do you think anything's going to change in terms of the law?
It's very hard to say, but you've got six, conservative justices, and you need five, obviously, to kind of overturn this long-standing precedent. My sense is that Justices Kavanaugh and Coney Barrett aren't in that camp, as to kind of, they may disagree with the policy, but then the answer is, as was said, was to go do a constitutional amendment, which would obviously come after quite a lengthy and divisive debate in Congress first, and then in the states. And they may think that's a good outcome. As you know, most of the world does not have a similar policy that we have in terms of kind of the rights for birthright. So they may encourage Congress and the states to jump in, but at the end of the day, I have a hard time imagining that Brett Kavanaugh wants to be the one to overturn this, especially because doing it retroactively would be so incredibly disruptive for so many people. So I don't see at the end of the day that they're going to be successful on this executive order. But obviously, with all the, like you said, all the other litigation, it's a lot of different processes. They may go to a lower court and take a while to get back up for a final review and decision.
Yeah, and on that, I know the president has had times we're the only country that has birthright citizenship, but that's far from the case. There are, there's much of the Western Hemisphere, dozens of countries like the United States do have birthright citizenship, and of course, the historical context is very interesting. Of course, in the 14th Amendment after the Civil War to clarify citizenship of Americans, including freed slaves. So there's a lengthy history there. But this is really helpful as we come off this very notable Supreme Court argument. This case is very likely going back to the Supreme Court at some point in the future.
I'll just mention one thing, Larry. I mean, again, it seems like a lot of these different cases we're saying are eventually going to get decided by the Supreme Court, and you got to believe that while they're not politicians, they are political, and eventually they're going to find some win. They're going to have some cases they're going to want the administration to win on, some that they're going to say no. And the question will be, where does the Chief Justice or five majority justices, where do they come down to kind of have that balance of outcomes? They're not going to be no on everything for the administration.
Thanks, Stuart. And I'm gonna address questions at the end, but there was one question that I'm seeing coming in now, which I think makes sense to clarify now. Just Margaret, if you can clarify it in like 30 seconds. Your reference to the fact that Alaska and Hawaii had different language in terms of not having subject to the jurisdiction. There's a question, why is that different? But you're talking about state constitutions, right? Why would that matter?
No, this is federal law. This is something
federal
that,
law. Sorry.
Yeah, the administration hasn't paid any attention to the statutes So in addition to the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, there are also statutes implementing the 14th Amendment. And there's one statute for the whole country that uses the subject to the jurisdiction language, but it excludes Alaska and Hawaii. And when Congress in 1952 passed laws relating to being born in Alaska and Hawaii, they left the subject to the jurisdiction language completely out of the statute. So anyone born in Alaska or Hawaii doesn't have to be subject to the jurisdiction in order to be an American citizen according to the statutes.
But
So they have to
still getting
repeal
back.
those,
No, thank you for clarifying that. And getting back to the main point, again, historically subject to the jurisdiction has really been limited to a very narrow category of people, primarily children of ambassadors and diplomats, and much more limited than what's being talked about here. But that's going to all get litigated. So I will turn to questions at the end. I do want to touch on one more segment now that Margaret is here, and I want to talk about some of the cases that I know we're following closely on. Um, what we've seen in terms of the administration talking about the existence of an invasion, taking actions on like invoking the Alien Enemies Act and sending people to El Salvador with minimal, if any, due process. Um, Margaret, in invoking Alien Enemies Act and utilizing other kind of rapid deportation shortcuts that avoid the step of having people being able to make their cases before a neutral adjudicator, whether it's an immigration judge or someone else. What impact have steps like that had on the rule of law and due process?
well, they appear to have something of a negative effect. We all, as Americans, hold due process pretty dear, and due process applies to everyone, not just people who are citizens of the United States. It applies to immigrants as well. And the fundamental idea is that you need to be given notice and an opportunity to be heard rather than just having your rights trampled on without that kind of due process. And that's pretty fundamental. I mean, it dates back to the Declaration of Independence. We didn't like the fact that King George wasn't giving us due process, and that's why we rebelled against our former ruler. So this is pretty fundamental. And one of the big problems with the Alien Enemies Act is that the original concept behind that was that there would actually be some military type invasion going on, with a foreign military, something like what happened with the Japanese attacking Alaska during World War II. They took over 2 islands in Alaska by force, and that was clearly an alien invasion. And that would implicate something like the Alien Invasion Act. But it's pretty clear that there's no invasion going on right now. There's no intentional military occupation of any part of our country at the moment by
Yeah, and we've
anybody.
seen, and on that, Margaret, I think we've seen what, three district courts now who've ruled on it, said they don't see an invasion. There was one federal court, I want to say maybe Pennsylvania, which deferred to the administration on that, but still said there needed to be additional due process. But we have seen some skepticism from the courts in this area. Um,
Right. And part of it is because the intelligence community came out and basically said there's no invasion. But the latest development, of course, is that the people who came out with that assessment are being told they're losing their jobs. So that's definitely of concern to anybody who cares about professionalism in the government and accurate intelligence assessments.
so the invasion the invasion declarations that we've seen from the administration is based on the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua, TDA,
Right.
which is a criminal gang that has engaged in certainly very troubling conduct. But there again, you've noted there's a specific requirement in the Alien Enemies Act, which dates back to the 18th century of an actual invasion and whether a non-state actor or non-governmental actor can do that. I guess what would be the security threat from a non-governmental actor from TDA? And then are there any surprising implications if an invasion declaration is upheld? What does that mean um, for a member of TDA? What rights would they have as foreign if they were invading uh, if they were invading force, would that have implications in terms of how they're treated under international law?
Well, it does. If they're technically invading force, then they're subject to the Geneva Conventions, which the U.S. is a party to. So oddly, we'd have to treat them in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, and that's one reason why a lot of people don't think it's appropriate to class a gang like Tren de Aragua as an invading enemy alien force, because they would end up having a lot more rights than they would have under U.S. criminal and immigration law. It's kind of like if you can imagine we decided to treat the mafia as an invading enemy, because they're all from Italy or something. We didn't do that before because we wanted to be able to prosecute them under U.S. criminal law, and you can't do that under the Geneva Conventions.
Yeah, but Stuart, I guess if you were to take, TDA members, um, and and put them through the regular process, they could be deported under an immigration court. They could be seen as deportable. Um, wouldn't there be a process where you could still move them through move them through the system in that manner as opposed to going through,
Sure.
yeah.
That's kind of what I mentioned. We started was there are processes to deport people. You get final orders of removal. We have millions of people that have them that we haven't located or kind of leaving. So there's plenty of ways to deport people. I'm not quite sure why they've chosen this legal fight, which is only going to have minimal impact on the numbers. If they're looking for a numbers game, we want to deport as many people as possible that are undocumented or criminal aliens or whatever sub population you want to define. I'm not quite sure why they're picking this fight. It may be that they think just the news fight is worth it. But I don't quite understand why they're just going through regular order, which has a long established way to deport people who have committed crimes.
Right.
And I know there are real questions that have been reported in the press about whether all the specific individuals or even most of them do in fact have gang ties. Some questions of the criteria they're using, whether it's tattoos, whether database hits. And I know many of those following this have filed those cases, and again, without an opportunity to make one's case, there's no way to separate out the valid cases of somebody who's been misidentified. I
And that's
do.
why, the CNSI group that both Margaret and I belong to, we put out a statement urging that this go through regular order with due process. That's why we have immigration courts and judges and people with the right to counsel if they can afford it. There's all kinds of protocols here that we follow in millions of other cases. I'm not quite sure we're not following it in this small handful.
Thank you, sir. I see the time, so I want to move on to some of the questions we've been getting. I have a number of questions here in the chat, so I want to turn to some of those. And the first question is for Chief Batista. It's a question about, when local law enforcement gets pulled in to carry out more of these immigration enforcement priorities. Does the federal government reimburse local law enforcement for all the time and expenses associated with this? Like, do they get reimbursed for officer time doing 287G training? How does this impact, your resources?
So it's never been my experience that the federal government reimburses for any of the work associated with the 287G program. So the answer is no, not on that. Like I said, I see it more of as an unfunded program that comes along, and just an added responsibility.
Thanks. And of course, if you're moving more resources into this area, it does take away resources, personnel, officer time from other priorities you have in the community in terms of public safety.
Right.
Question for I think this one maybe should go to Margaret, but what rights exist while someone's awaiting to get a court hearing on humanitarian relief? We currently have a very limited path now to get asylum. There isn't asylum at the border. Given what we're seeing in terms of the backlogs, some of the, I think we even saw some immigration judges terminated or removed by this administration. And of what exists for somebody who maybe has a due process, but they're just waiting in a long backlog.
Well, it's going to depend on what they applied for, but let's take the example of applying for asylum. So if somebody has actually filed an asylum application with USCIS or with the immigration court, they're entitled to have a hearing on their asylum application. And if it's with the immigration court, they're entitled to have a hearing with an immigration judge. So it actually has been problematical that they've been terminating immigration judges because it means people are going to have to wait longer for a hearing. And that's definitely problematical. And there's also a problem within the agency for people who are filing with USCIS that the asylum offices don't have enough personnel. They have a huge backlog. A lot of people have been leaving the administration, so there's not enough asylum officers to adjudicate the cases. And this means very, very long backlogs. In some cases, people wait in a detention center while they're waiting for the hearing. But in many other cases, they're out in the community. They do eventually sometimes get the right to work, but they have to wait a 6-month period in order to be able to work once they've filed for asylum. So we're seeing huge backlogs right now, where people are going to be waiting probably 5 or 10 years. And the interesting thing to me is that most of the people now that are getting hearing notices are going to be getting hearings after President Trump leaves office, because of the policies that he's putting in place that are causing great backlogs in the system.
Great. Thanks, Margaret.
And Larry, this is one of the reasons I raised it earlier. Like if we're investing large amounts of money in this system and you want to have a better system, if you're the administration, they really should be asking for more case officers and asylum officers and kind of get the court process unglued, because the backlog is so long that it's not that credible. That's the problem.
Thanks, Stewart. Couple questions for Chief Batista. First, a clarifying question. I think it's noteworthy. When we were talking about lack of reimbursement, that's just a more general reimbursement for jurisdictions or those who join 287G. I know the federal government pays for training. There is something like Operation Stone Garden where there are some federal reimbursements. So that is a good point by whoever raised it. There are some programs that exist. 287G though is one that's really ramped up over the past 4 months, and that one, when a department sends officers to take part in a multi-week training, there's not reimbursement for the officer time.
Yeah, so my response was in the context of 287G.
Yeah.
Stone Garden has historically been used for a wide variety of alien smuggling and drug smuggling. So it's not like specific to immigration, but it is been, like I said, human trafficking, drug trafficking has been a cornerstone of that program for many years. Correct.
Thanks for helping clarify that.
Yeah.
Another question, I think this is building off of this 287G discussion again, the technical name of that program, but as the administration put the 287G program back into place, it's now allowing for something called a task force model, in which it's not only deputizing local law enforcement to carry out immigration functions inside a jail. So we had this model in place where it was a local law enforcement officer who works for the jail, was trained under 287G, and they could hand over someone whose sentence was expiring to immigration authorities when there was a request made. But now they're going back to something called the task force model, in which people are trained, local law enforcement is trained, and they're carrying out patrol functions and other functions sort of more publicly, more visibly in the community. And I know that was something which existed, I think, from the early 2000s to 2012. Have you seen much in terms of problems from going to that model from your experience? And if not, we have a resource here at the forum that talks about that new model. But have you seen much in terms of disparities and how that's played out when you've had those task force models in place? I know you don't have one where you are.
Yeah, no. So I think it's important, right, to talk about the various levels of cooperation that we have with the federal law enforcement agencies. Because, look, if we are pursuing a violent criminal, a homicide suspect, a rape suspect, robbery suspect, then we want to collaborate and work together in order to get some of these most dangerous criminals out of our communities. But and to that end, local law enforcement, municipal law enforcement, state law enforcement has been involved and engaged in task force models with the FBI, the DEA, for many, many years for all the reasons I just outlined. This most recent development of using it as a tool to go after immigration work specifically, again, I understand that that's probably occurring around the country, but it's not something that I've ever seen as the priority for local law enforcement, because our job, as I've talked about already, is about creating a trust in a relationship with our communities. And that immigration work is solely the function of the federal government and not local municipal policing.
Great. Thanks so much. Well, I'm looking at the time, and it's 5 minutes left, so I do want to start wrapping this up. And thank you all for joining this panel. I know this is really informative and interesting for me. I hope it was informative for all you in the audience. But hearing from all of you with your expertise, national security, law enforcement, the law, as to the intersection of security, whether that's public safety, whether it's national security, and on the need to preserve the rule of law and due process. These are very tough issues, and we're in a very tough time in immigration policy. So I appreciate having the insight from all of you and hearing your thoughts on this. I also want to use the chance to promote an upcoming webinar that we have. So as Jenny mentioned at the beginning, this is our second webinar in the Security and series. Our next webinar is going to be a little less than a month on Wednesday, June 12th, also 2 p.m. Eastern. Security and a strong economy. We're going to be hearing from panelists talking about the interplay between having security here in the U.S., but also ensuring that our economy thrives, that consumers do well, that businesses do well, and that we continue to grow and thrive as a country, even as we look at securing the United States. So encourage you all to register for that. If you like this, I think you'll also like that panel too. And again, want to extend my thanks and gratitude for all of you for joining, to the panelists and also to you in the audience. Thanks so much. Appreciate everything here from all of you, and look forward to monitoring these issues in the coming weeks and months. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.